Mm, well,
There we go.
you're recording. Hey, everybody! It's week
Where'd you all come
3.
from?
Where'd you all come from? We're just sitting here chatting, having a good time. It is week 3 of our uh, write a novel in 60-day novel challenge. Excuse me. Let me get the title correct. Week 3. This week we are focusing on conflict and subplots. And you might think conflict and subplots, what total random uh two topics to shove together in one episode. Nay, nay. Conflict and subplots, they they walk hand in hand. And today we're going to talk all about that. I did notice yesterday that I think it was Jacob posted in the Storycraft Cafe
Mhm.
about us having an extra week in October. Would you like to speak to that, Doug, and how that
Sure.
extra? It's actually an extra couple of days,
Mhm.
but I think there's 3 at, to fully embrace the week month schedule. We need 28 days. October has
Okay.
31, so we have 3 extra days. It's not actually an
Yeah.
extra week, but anyway.
So so first, hello to Steph from Central New York
Hey,
State.
Steph.
um so it's the 60-day novel challenge, and we're doing it over October and November, but 60 days is catchy. Really, there's 61 days because we have October and November mushed together, but we have to make some kind of curriculum or setup
Right.
for us to follow, which doesn't work for 60 or 61 days when everyone operates on a 7-day week. So the fates were against us. So the way that we've set up the challenge is broken down into 8 weeks. We all know this, I think, and you're here in week 3, so you get the general idea so far. What we did
Yeah.
is we started on Thursday, October 3rd. Right, so we didn't actually start on the first day of October, and that was our kickoff week 1 event. And the idea is that we want to have these events to introduce the week's topics to you, to show you what we've done, to answer any questions, and then send you on your way to do those exercises in the Dabble template. And then when the next Thursday comes around, when we're back here talking about week 2, ideally you've done the homework and you're ready to launch into the next set of exercises. So I know it's a little weird because it's a Thursday to Thursday rotation, which
Yeah.
no one operates on, but we do now. So
But we do. You can't
and the
say no
nice
one
thing,
does.
yeah, the nice thing is that we have week 3 this week. So next week we have week 4. We all know
Yep.
how numbers work like this. Well, that will push us into the last week of preparing for
Yep.
writing. And then when October 31st hits, the last day of October, we will talk about the first act, writing the first act, your opening scenes, the inciting incident, all of that. And so that way, when November 1st hits, mere hours later, depending on where you are in the world, you are set to actually go and start writing right away. So
Mere hours.
yeah, we've thought this through kind of, or it just happened to work out like that. Who knows? The world will never know.
You know? Or we may
Yeah.
be overly chatty one day and the world will know. Who knows? Yeah.
Dabble conspiracy 61-day
Hmm.
novel challenge.
Hmm. Hmm.
Chris asking here, before we dive into this week's content, Chris asking, will there ever be a Dabble Writer Conference? I'd love that, especially to meet everyone we see on all of the online gatherings and in the cafe. Well, we can certainly pass that along. I don't, nothing is impossible. I'm not gonna say we're not gonna do that. But as it stands, we don't have any plans in the foreseeable future for that. But
Yeah.
Robert, the one is accusing us of conspiracy, is the one that would champion that. So I'm gonna leave that with him.
Yeah. You never know that all of this online challenge talk might just be priming the pump for an in-person event. You just don't know.
We don't
You
know,
just don't know.
but don't let that make you think that there is something, because right now we don't have anything.
Right.
Thank you. You're a little too promising.
D- don't bring truth into a good conspiracy theory. That's the fun of a good conspiracy theory is that it can literally be anything.
There,
Yeah.
we're on the right track, Chris. If it happens, you can congratulate or blame yourself. Uh, Veronica from Kent in the UK. Hello, Veronica. And Catherine from
Hello.
Germany. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. All right. So we got that out of the way, a little
Yeah.
idea for the future and some justification for our Thursday to Thursday weeks.
Yeah.
So why don't we get started with this week's stuff? Hank,
Why
do
don't
you
we,
do you want
Doug?
do you want me to lead or do you want to
Yeah,
lead?
go
Who?
ahead, and I'll
Okay,
I have lots of notes on my other
excellent.
monitor over here that I will randomly spring upon you.
All right. So, as Hank mentioned, this week is all about conflicts and subplots.
Yeah.
And maybe you are like Hank and think that those are a weird combination. Maybe you're like me and think those go hand in hand, like Hank showed us at the end, the big reveal of his intro. But these are important parts to your story. So, in this 60-day novel challenge, we started with the big picture, right? The big concept that you're working with, getting your main story beats in line, understanding what you want to write. Last week we looked at characters. Characters are super important, and hopefully if you did the exercises, you figured out that characters don't just kind of operate within your plot, but they are a key component to the plot. Hank, you always say characters are plot are
Yes.
characters, or is character. That I hope you've seen that. Now we're gonna iron it out a little more because characters need things to push them or stall them or force them to change in order for them to be interesting in a story, and that's where
Yep.
we arrive at conflict.
Right.
um I've said this before, I'll say it again. Book without conflict is a textbook, and we're not writing textbooks here, we're writing stories, we're writing novels. So Hank, what? Just give me some of your initial thoughts about why conflict is important, what we use it for, that sort of
I'll
stuff.
I have said this before. I don't approach storycraft w- in a way that I don't try to overcomplicate the process of telling a story. And I think some of that comes with um, maturity, and by maturity I mean just trying things long enough to learn some things. In the beginning, I think a lot of storytellers, myself included, because I'm speaking from my experience, you feel like you need to do something different. You need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, because you feel like that things need to be overly different or complicated to stand out in an overcrowded field. Some of that is true, but the way we think about it is we complicate things too much. Storycraft is simple. Create a character that people love, that they want to root for, and then do horrible things to them. That's my philosophy. And but create a character that people want to root for, give them a goal or something that they are aspiring to, and then throw everything possible in their path to prevent them from doing that. And then let those things that you throw at them be an opportunity for that character to grow and change and learn and succeed through trials. And there's conflict. You can throw some subplots in there as side quest, or other characters that have their own challenges that seem to dovetail with your character's challenges. I and then you have a story. You have characters that people love, you have conflicts, things for them to come against, and that come against them. We've growth for our character through those conflicts, and then we have a resolution. Storycraft is just that simple. And when you break it down like that, it just seems very simplistic, but that's what great stories are made of. And then how you put the window dressing you put on that, and all of the extra color that you add to that story is up to you, and that's how you stand out from everyone else. But the the core story that you're telling is really a simple process, and has been for thousands and thousands of years, as long as humans have been telling stories.
Mhm. Well, Hank, how am I supposed to follow that?
Well, you're not.
Oh,
That's why. Well, thank you
that's
all for
it.
joining us. We'll
Bye,
see you
everyone.
next Thursday.
No, I will take a second here to
Yeah.
say Hi to David and hi to TW. TW pointing out your snazzy lights, which I also appreciate.
Well, it's an ever changing process. The studio setup here, and I was in the middle of putting new lights up, and I ran out of time. So we'll see how that on our show tomorrow. We'll see how the lights have turned out.
Yeah, and so it's funny because you say you always overcomplicate things, but when you dial it back, you really like you don't need to, right? Like you
Right.
said. And I think that is what I want people to carry into the exercises this week because there are only two real exercises in this week's homework, but they are big exercises and you can
Yeah.
get as complex as you want. But you'll notice that both of them have a section where they have a simple summary for your conflict and for some subplots when you come up with those. And if you find that you can't condense down your conflict or your subplot into something that's manageable and bite sized for you to understand, perhaps you've overcomplicated things a little bit. But I want to take a step back and I want to talk about conflict and the two different types, just so everyone has this general idea of what we're going into this week and why conflict is important. And primarily, I like to say that conflict is important because characters, like people, don't want to change. Nobody will change just for the sake of changing. There needs to be something that drives that change. If you want to get a better job, you go get more training or something. You want to be healthier, you go to the gym. You want to get better at a video game, you play more. Oh no, all of those don't necessarily sound like conflict. I know a lot of people will think when I say conflict they think sword fights or throwing magic spells back and forth at each other, which is conflict, but conflict isn't just that.
Right.
Yeah. And so conflict we break down into two main groups. We have external conflict and we have internal conflict, and they are separate but they are intertwined, specifically for your protagonist. The external conflict is what I like to call the sexy conflict. It's the one that sells the books because people will be like, "Ooh, that sounds fun." No one hears about an internal conflict and is like, "Oh, I really want to read about that character growth." But the external conflict is the fun one. It's kind of the main external conflict of your plot is what your plot is about. It is the big thing stopping your protagonist from reaching their goal. In mine, it is a city that is collapsing and full of demons. Hank, in yours, I believe it is a dead body and a mystery that needs solving.
That's
Right
correct. That's correct.
now, for a quick little description here, just so everyone's on the same page, we can break external conflict down further. You can do character versus character, which is like your protagonist versus your antagonist. Character versus society, when there's societal expectations on a character that's forcing them to do something. Character versus nature, which I always think there was a Liam Neeson movie where he was in a plane up in like Alaska
Oh,
or
I know
whatever
that
the
movie.
yeah, and it crashes, and then like the wolves are chasing him, and it's cold and stuff.
Yeah.
That's nature, right? Because the
Yeah.
wolves aren't trying to be menaces; they're just being wolves, and the snow's not trying to be rude; it's just being snow. So that's character versus nature.
Right.
Character versus technology can be something like robots, where they're actively working against a character, or it can be something like social media having a negative impact on a character. Character versus supernatural is sort of like character and nature combined, but the supernatural element is generally larger and more powerful than the protagonist, and so they're really struggling in that regard. And then character versus fate or destiny, which is where they're trying to deny their fate, but something keeps dragging them towards it. So when it comes to external conflict, you have a lot of options. And even like something might fall into three of those categories, or something might barely fall into one of those categories. Your conflict is unique to you, but those are some things that you can start thinking about to generate that external conflict. Hank,
Yes.
what tell me more about your external conflict, because I briefly summarized it in one sentence there, but what do you think you got going on?
So the external conflict is I actually have a couple and I'm just thinking through as we go. The we have a conflict. Well, the obvious conflict is there's a dead body, and the dead body is found um, on my protagonist girlfriend on the steps of his girlfriend's bookstore slash coffee bar. And his girlfriend is kind of a co-protagonist. She's very much a part of the story and a part of how the mystery is solved. They're kind of co-protagonists. So he is inadvertently kind of brought into this through osmosis, through being connected through this. So he kind of doesn't have a choice but to be involved. So that's one conflict, and then there's a larger conflict, and this is kind of where subplots come in, where there is um, a political is not really the right word, but there are factions within this small town that have been kind of old lineage of people that have lived in this town who all have different motives for wanting to maintain control, wanting to stay on top of kind of how the town is steered, going into the future, fortunes and different things like that. I'm being kind of vague because I'm still working out some of the plot there, but there are people that have varied interests that are sometimes causing things to happen, sometimes stepping in the way of progress happening, sometimes stepping in the way of the police, different things there, lots of different motives, and a lot of those people with different motives are controlling how the story unfolds and whether our protagonist has success or not.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'll briefly explain mine too, but I do encourage anyone in the chat here to, if you have an idea, as short or long as you want about your external conflict specifically, go ahead, drop that in the chat. If you have an idea for an internal conflict, go ahead, drop that. I'm not going to stop you. But if you want to stay thematic, we're talking external conflict to start. But yeah, and so mine, on the other hand, is sort of a two-pronged approach. The goal of my protagonist is to get people out of this city to safety. And so the conflict comes from two places. The primary place is my antagonist, big bad monster that keeps getting in the way and
Right.
ruining everyone's day to keep it as PG as I can. And the other one is the environment itself. The city is a war zone to the nth degree. Buildings are falling down, gangs everywhere. Not a good place. So the environment itself, nature to a degree, even if it's an urban environment, is working against my character and her goals. So I'm really excited for that aspect of my story.
Nice. Sounds like
So,
sounds like your story has a lot of external conflict, and where mine is some external conflict that kicks off a lot of internal conflict,
mhm.
which interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how these two stories uh, evolve and kind of what the catalyst is for each of them.
And it's interesting because in my writing process, when I think of something, I often think of it from like a cinematic perspective or an external conflict perspective. And then I'll work backwards. And that's why last week, when we were talking about the big hurt and the lie and backstory, that's why I get so passionate about it, because I have the situation that I want my characters to be in. How do I make it meaningful? How do I then
Right.
turn it into internal conflict? So the external conflict, the flashy part that I really like writing, how do I make that meaningful? How do I make it worth reading? And so that perfect segue, Hank, into what internal conflict is. Now, internal conflict can honestly be summarized as a character versus self, if we want to put it in the same ways as the external conflicts. And that is not an external pressure or threat, though that may influence their thinking, but there is something inside that is messing with them and stopping them from getting their goals. And remember, conflict isn't always punching and kicking, it is getting in the way of what they want. And so that's how we define internal conflict here. And I do have five
Can we
types of, oh, yeah.
before we do that? Can we pop up Robert's comment here for just a second? Some monster hunters that are on their last coin and need a job. A farm girl offers them exposure and food if they take down a dragon along with anything in its hoard. They begrudgingly take the job. Is this medieval social media influencers? That's kind
I'm
of
going to say it's an
fantastic,
urban
Robert.
fantasy, but I like, even from this description, you can get this idea of the world as well, right?
Right.
Exposure for taking down a dragon. Okay, dragons are normal or monsters are normal in this world. I love
Yeah.
that.
I love that too.
And
That's gonna be
then
fantastic.
a little less drive-in movie theater, a little more maybe award-winning. We have Brittany here with my character is an ambitious woman in 1920s, and the main external conflicts are society's view on the working woman and her husband getting in the way, which is excellent external conflict and will
Oh, yeah.
really leverage into internal conflict as well. Awesome.
Good
Okay,
work,
so our
man.
types of internal conflict. These are I find that the boundaries of these five kind of buckets are a little more ambiguous and there is a little bleeding into one another. But we
Yeah.
have moral conflict, which is where they believe they should be doing something or they want to believe they should be doing something, but they can't quite reach the morals that they want for themselves. Identity conflict, which is where you don't know who you are, your place in the world, what you want to be when you grow up. Religious or philosophical conflict is when there are tenets of a belief that you follow or a system in place that contradict the ones that you are believing yourself. Self esteem conflict is more, am I good enough? Can I succeed here? Do I need to do something else? Should someone else take over for me? And then relationship conflict, less they're like less about the person in the relationship conflicting with our protagonist and more about the protagonist's feeling of worth in the relationship. Am I good enough to be here? So sort of like self-esteem. Am I worthy of love? That sort of stuff is what you're looking at in relationship conflict. So we have here too. David, mine starts as a quest to find something, then ends with facing a betrayer who steals the object. Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent
that's
stuff.
so many, great, especially fantasy stories that just immediately come to mind, start with a premise like that, and,
Mhm.
what a great foundation for a story.
Well, I've referenced it like 17 times in our live events, but the Dungeons and Dragons movie, Honor Among Thieves with Chris Pine, that's how it starts, right?
Yep.
And that's then take it and make it your own. You
Yeah,
use the characters to bring that conflict to life.
and that's exactly what I meant by, so many times our stories kind of are born of the same premise or the same, kind of circumstances, but then how you tell that story, how you populate that story with characters that you've created and their hopes and desires and wants and skills and all of that, take a simple premise that has been done so many times, uh, and then makes that something really unique, powerful, enjoyable, you know, that's we don't have to overcomplicate the premise of what we're getting at is what I'm trying to say. You don't have to, but then how you color that story, that's what makes it really special and unique.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, internal conflicts are always, but almost always, I'll say, just in case there's any outliers, related to a flaw in a character. That's how they come up. For a lot of characters, a lot of protagonists, I'll say, it will be connected to what we deemed the big hurt last week, the traumatic event that led to this lie that they believe. That's not necessarily the case. Not every character has a lie stemming from a big hurt, especially secondary characters. They might not have that traumatic past, but all internal conflicts are tied to some kind of flaw. And in my protagonist case, especially, it is that big lie. So, as Hank and I will describe a little bit about our internal conflict. Let us know in the chat what your internal conflict for your protagonist is. You think, if you don't know yet, or what kind of inklings of ideas that you have. And before Hank, we talk about our own. I also want to mention, and I'll elaborate on this after we chat a little bit, but internal conflict for your protagonist, their main internal conflict, will be tied to the external conflict. And generally, for good internal conflict, you want it to be resolved at the same time as the external conflict during the climax. That's how you go from an exciting scene to a memorable, awesome favorite scene, right? Because it's not just about being the best swordsman. It's about, having the confidence to be that best swordsman. It makes it meaningful to the character, and the journey along the way kind of ties those two together. So, that said, Hank, do you have any thoughts for your internal conflict for your novel?
Um, I my internal conflict, stems from Walt, uh, my protagonist. Is he knows that he's a mystery novelist or an aspiring mystery novelist. He knows that he's technically good, um, but his technical ability gets in his way of telling a compelling story sometimes, and he's under a time crunch. He's got some money that his grandfather left him, and it's enough for him to live about 2 years and just fully pursue this. He's got all of his technical ability down. He's a great writer, but he's just missing something. And a lot of this self-confidence stems from some things in his past that he's still kind of wrestling with, and being thrust into kind of the catalyst for the story, this dead body that happens. Allows him to work through some things that help him to put some issues in his past to rest, but also helps him to become a better storyteller through living some of this instead of just having an academic understanding of the genre that he's pursuing. So it's a little bit of, kind of patching up some old wounds that he has, while also discovering some real world grit that then transforms his what he's putting on the page. So that I'm kind
Excellent.
of taking a two pronged approach there.
Yeah. Now, does your main character have some kind of traumatic event, some big hurt in their past?
He does, and I'm still kind of working through some of the details of that, but there definitely is a thing that's kind of,
Okay.
and I'm trying to discover if I want to fully address that in this book, but I'm thinking of this book as having series potential. So I'm thinking of ways that I can have him accomplish a big thing for this book, but still leave some unresolved that continues to drive him forward. So, and that's one thing I'm working on this week, going through some of these exercises.
Excellent. Before I share mine, Catherine shared that her MC wants to desperately save her sibling, needs a new heart, but she can't afford the augmentation or surgery and has to find other ways to save her sibling, pitting her against society. The fact that, Catherine, you mentioned augmentation makes me
Yeah,
think we're looking at some cyberpunk
that was my
genres.
thought as well.
Because it could really go either way, right?
Yeah,
A
yeah,
commentary on the health industry or something, or
right.
mega corporations and human augmentation.
Catherine said
There
yes.
we go.
So all of the things
Excellent.
we assumed apparently are true. I love it. I love it.
For my own, I do have, or I did
And and
dig
and
really.
let me just say this, Doug, that you said, it could be a cyberpunk or it could be, a commentary on the health system. It could be all of those.
Both.
We
Yeah.
could use a cyberpunk story to be a commentary on. That's the great thing about storytelling. It can be all those things.
Which, jumping the gun a little bit because next week we're talking about theme,
Yes.
amongst other stuff.
Yeah.
So, for mine, my internal conflict for my protagonist really stems from her big hurt, where she made a decision, was brash, was arrogant, and that got her best friend killed. And ever since then, she has not been the same person. She has not been as confident. She second guesses herself all the time, and she only feels safe when she is with the people in her unit, specifically her commander, Emmanuel, who will, when we talk about subplots, that's a relationship I want to pursue. And so, with that in mind, I am intentionally using the external conflict to isolate her so that there are moments, or not moments, there are many chunks of the story where she's by herself, away from the people that give her this sort of comfort and security. Because when she has that security blanket removed, then she is sometimes paralyzed to the detriment of those around her. And what I'm really excited to do is give, like, put her in that situation, make her uncomfortable, make her scared, give her some confidence, let her make a choice that makes it seem as if she's resolved this big lie that she's attached to, and then being like, no, you still failed, and then plunge her deeper into into this sad internal conflict so she can resolve it eventually in the climax. But that's when we did the character development workshop last week, one of the graphics that I highlighted showed just a rough, sketch of internal and external conflict, and both of them go like this, and they intersect one another and whatnot. And that's how you get the juiciest stuff, right? It shouldn't just be, we think about like the 3-act structure, and a lot of people just think about a pyramid, or we think about, even the Fichtean curve. It has like little fins going up it, but it should be even more drastic than that. Let them win, then make it hurt, and then let them try and fail and try and fail, and then win, and then, oh, we're right back.
Right.
Right, that's the exciting stuff.
And let me pop up David's comment real quick, because as you were talking about that, he said, "My protagonist faces a choice at the end that makes him face his lie, but throughout the story, it's challenged, so even he doesn't know what he believes anymore." And
Excellent.
you're talking about that try-fail cycle, and
Hmm.
the part about he's challenged so that he doesn't know what he believes. That sounds like a great setup for a dark night of the soul point of your story, which
Absolutely.
is a fantastic part of the try fail cycle, and usually comes right before a success. But he's got to learn something through that dark night of the soul that
Hmm.
allows him to, or her,
Or
to find that
David, do
success.
they succumb to the lie at the end? Like, is this a
Yeah,
positive story, or is this a negative arc or a
yeah.
corruption arc?
Or is it just everybody dies? Credits.
Robert here, his MC, his main character wants to be somebody. He's convinced that he will find his worth in the eyes of others and in his accomplishments.
Mm.
External validation and the best kind of validation traditionally. So, but see, that's it. And what's interesting about this one, and I can pick on Robert a little bit. It's not even picking on; it's just using him as an example. We can use this one because a lot of people believe this to be true. A lot of people in real life want external validation for whatever they spend their time doing. So we can instantly connect to something like that in a book, and then Robert goes and makes it his own. Right?
Yeah,
That's what makes it cool, and that, harkens back to you saying, "Don't overcomplicate it. Start with
right.
something simple." For mine, it's self-esteem issues caused by grief. I think a lot of people can relate to that. So, start simple, build from there.
Yeah.
And then, Fortune here, my main character is cursed to not feel any emotions, but he needs to break the curse before a great calamity befalls his kingdom. But how does he break the curse when he has no motivation to do anything about it? You can take that last sentence too and replace "how does he break the curse" with "how does Doug work some days?" Just kidding. Little self-deprecating humor here.
Yeah.
Uh, but no, that I that's something that we can all relate to as well, right?
The
Motivation.
And everyone remember that this past Monday was Canadian Thanksgiving. So how does Doug
You're lucky I'm
do
here.
do a show on Thursday when he's still in a turkey coma from Monday?
I'm still tired. And it doesn't help that there's always leftovers from turkey, and so I'm eating turkey every day, and so I'm just tired all the time.
Yeah. So you're just in a tryptophan haze.
Yeah, but I knew I'd be here with you, Hank. I'd be here with our awesome 60-day participants, so I had to be here.
Right, right.
All right. So that's the gist of conflicts, right? And so you want to think about your external conflict. There will be multiple external conflicts in your story, but for the purposes of our challenge, at least start mapping out the big one, the one that your protagonist is forcing themselves through to reach their goal. And at the same time, anyone that can consider themselves having a self, whether that be a person or an android or a robot or an orc or alien or whatever, they can have an internal conflict. Not every character needs an external conflict. Not every character needs, or sorry, an internal conflict. Not every
Mhm.
character needs their own unique external conflict, right? But if you put the time in to develop them using the exercises, then you can have more in your story to flesh it out more.
Righto.
Okay. So also, what I should note is we've reserved some time at the end for Q&A. So if anyone listening has questions about conflict, about subplots, about anything we've covered so far in the 60-day challenge, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll either answer them as they come in or we'll get to them at the end. Yeah. So otherwise, let's chat about subplots for a sec or moment, a handful of moments. This actually, I didn't think I was going to struggle with this one as much as I did,
Yeah.
because subplots for me, a lot of the times they've come up naturally. Like part of my process is a lot of plotting, but still a good amount of pantsing. And specifically for a 50,000 word novel, like that is, it's going to be less than a third of the novel that I'm working on right now, where I have all these cool subplots and I like to think of them distinctly as their own plot line. But then I had to take a
Right.
step back and reframe how I was thinking and say, okay, subplots don't have to be their own plot line separate from like parallel to and weaving through the main plot. They can kind of run next to them. They can be one and the same, but
Mhm.
just different stuff in there, right?
Right.
So Hank, tell me about how you go about subplotting, how you come up with subplot ideas and any you've come up with.
The way I started thinking about subplots, because when I was a new writer, I didn't give very much thought to subplots. You think about a story that you're telling, and you just try to get from A to Z, and just or A to Z, and you just run through it. And then as you as you kind of grow as a writer, and you start thinking of how to um, and I learned a lot of this from talking to some thriller and horror writers, especially, is because if you're writing a story, for instance, if you're writing a thriller, maybe a psychological suspense, or a political thriller where the adrenaline is just kind of pegged out all the time, or a horror novel where you've got a group of people and horrible things are happening around them. What you can't do is just peg out the reader's adrenaline and just keep it there at 10 from
Mhm,
page 1 through 400. You need to inject moments of levity a lot of times, or some glimpses of normal life to allow that adrenaline to come back down, and to give the to let the reader off the hook a little bit. And then, when you bring those moments of tension, or, bring a scare back in, it hits even harder because you've allowed the reader to recover, and their, uh, their tension level has come down, and then you hit them with that again, and it's that much more impactful. So, when I started kind of thinking that way, I started finding ways to bring in other stories that seemingly are unconnected, or at least seem like side quest, or from another character's point of view, while my other story is running its course, and then I let the reader take a take a side road for a little bit, and then come back into the story. So I start thinking about subplots as a way to manipulate the reader's emotion a lot of time, to give them more information, for sure, to fill out the story in a way. But I think of the emotional impact that I can bring about with subplots, of
mhm,
building the reader's trust in the world, or um, give them more understanding, or just bring moments of levity, moments of empathy for the world and for the characters, and then bring them back into the story. So that's that really, I think what I'm saying is those are things that I try to accomplish with subplots. So I think about it in that way. What can I do? How can I find a way in the story that can open another door and allow me to um, because I'm holding the reader in my hand, and I'm manipulating them in essence as the writer, and I'm just looking for ways to toy with them, and that's what I'm accomplishing, or trying to accomplish, with subplots a lot of times.
I like that. So Hank writes to be mean to the people who pay
Yes,
for his book.
100%. Yes.
Now, this isn't directly subplot related, but what you
But
were
I only mean to them to then give them a satisfying
mhm.
ending at the end. So it's a bit of a Svengali, if you anyway,
That's the
that's a
difference between
side.
you and I. See, I'm
Yeah.
mean to them only to be meaner to them. at the end.
Right.
So
Right. I wanna be the hero ultimately at the end, but only after subtle manipulation.
So something you mentioned there is you don't want to bombard a reader with just
Right.
like scene, action, action, action. And we call that scene and sequel. And I'm sharing a link to an article that our pal Abby wrote at W. And it's a really once you understand how that flow kind of works, you're able to pace out your novel a little bit more. And it works for subplots, but it's just good for writing in general
Yeah.
to understand that. So, because anytime I get a chance to shamelessly plug a W article, you know I'm going to do it.
100%. Oh, yeah.
Uh, so when it comes to the subplots that I'm thinking about, again, I was struggling a little bit going into this. So I what helps, and I'm not saying this just because it's our template and I want everyone to do the exercises, but when I started doing the exercises, things started piecing themselves together.
Right.
And right off the bat in the subplotting exercises, you'll see there's four prompts to get you thinking about subplots. And so the first one, main story goal versus personal goals, right? How can you leverage that? And not just thinking about your protagonist, but your secondary characters as well. Unresolved issues or motivations, thematic subplots, and conflict based subplots. And really, I mean, because I love conflict so much, I really dialed in on the last one there and thought to myself, okay, we have this crumbling city. What subplots can I introduce to make it seem more alive? And I referenced earlier one of the environmental elements that would add conflict to our main character are gangs of people. And so I want a subplot at least introducing one of those gangs, if not going a little bit farther, because I know I want that to play a bigger role in the sequel in this
Right.
duology. So there's that. There's the romance subplot that I want. That again, we're just setting up the inklings of, and then like what's the word I'm looking for? Bringing him more to life in the sequel.
Mhm.
But romance isn't the only relationship either. And you'll see in both conflicts and the subplot exercises, there's space to flesh out relationships and how conflicts interact with relationships and develop them or hinder them, how subplots can map relationships for you.
Yeah.
And so I have another character who is almost like a rival to my protagonist, but more a rival to who my protagonist used to be. And so this character really wants our protagonist to be that confident, butt kicking warrior from before, and is very vocal about her displeasure that our protagonist is not that person anymore. So I'm going to have a whole subplot there where they're not going to become amicable necessarily, but our protagonist is going to earn the respect of that character without wholly becoming who they were, if that makes sense. So
Yep.
the thing I still like, the thing that I think people need to keep in mind, I know a lot of people participating in the 60-day novel challenge are writing 50,000 words and then writing another 30,000 or another 50,000 or 100,000, however many, right? You're just using us to help you get there. If you are writing a 50,000 word novel, you just need to be cognizant of how many subplots you're layering in there, because a shallow bad subplot is way worse than no subplot at all.
Right.
We have a question here that just came in from Brittany. Can there be two main plots, or should I treat one as a subplot? I have my ambitious woman who wants to accomplish great things, plus a significant love triangle. So, I have an answer. I have something primed for this already, but do you want to say anything, Hank?
Just because I don't have something primed for this, so I'm
Okay.
just grabbing off the top of my head. I would say yes, but if you can tie them together at the end. Like, I think it's
Hmm.
perfectly fine to have 2, um, disparate paths going forward, but for me, they need to converge at the end. Um, or if it's a series and they're not going to converge at the end, I would think at least hint to the reader that there will be some convergence. That um, I don't know. I'm gonna think on that a little bit. But what do you think about that,
I
Doug?
think I think it's okay to have two plots that are very heavy and very important, but I think one is always going to win out over the other.
Yeah.
And for that, I would encourage you, Brittany, to look at your protagonists and how the internal and external conflicts tie together, because those two coming together are going to be your main plot, and how they get resolved is going to help you figure out what your plot is. So the love triangle can still be significant, it can still get a lot of screen time, and it can play into resolving that main plot, but it might not be, what is your protagonist's ultimate goal, right? And how do they have to change to achieve that goal, or how do they change and then their goal changes? The love triangle more sounds like, at least just from your previous quick description, the love triangle almost sounds like it's going to support or hinder her transformation while still playing a very critical role. But it's tough to know without knowing more details. But especially if you're aiming for that 50,000 word um like maximum, if that's what you're aiming for, having two significant plots is going to really cut down on how much you can develop either.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're gonna fit all of that into 50,000 words, we're not gonna be able to go very deep on character
Yeah.
specifically. Yeah.
And Robert pointed out here, if there's a love triangle and it's a different primary audience than if it's about ambition, which is, uh, I agree to an extent. I would encourage you, Brittany, then based off Robert's comment here, um, look at your genre too.
Yes.
Are you writing a love triangle story, or are you writing a story about her ambitions and about her growth?
Yeah.
And
And it
Brittany's writing along at 50,000. So
yes, and Brittany, I think that's a great point because just because we're writing 50,000 words in
mhm,
November doesn't mean that has to be the end of your book, and, I mine, I fully expect to be about 80,000 words, but I
mhm,
plan to get a very firm foundation for that written in November.
yeah. Brittany, if you don't mind sharing, and you're more than welcome to say no, jot down in a comment who your main character is, what her goal is, and how she has to change to get there. Because I think that's going to help. The love triangle seems like it's going to be an important, like, love triangles to me seem like they are an important romantic arc and subplot, but I think once we dial in on what your character actually wants, we'll start to see whether the love triangle is the main plot or not.
Right. And depending on, the 3 people in the triangle, what their motivations are and what they
Mhm.
bring to the story, it could cause a completely different outcome than you might expect. I mean,
Yeah,
characters are, should be three-dimensional people that bring all sorts of stuff to the story.
yeah. And actually, I mean, you can put it in a comment, but you can also post it in the Storycraft Cafe
Yeah,
community under the show your work. And then we can, say it's open for feedback, and then we can leave some comments on it. Because I think there's also like 100 character limit or something on on chats. So plus it's not fair to put you on the spot.
yeah,
So cafe is the best way to go.
yeah.
Talking myself through that one. Um,
Nothing like making decisions live.
Hank, for subplots,
Yeah.
do they need to relate to the main plot? Speaking of these main plots.
Do they need to relate to this, main plot? I think on the surface, they could seem to not relate to it, but I always try to I think of 2 roads running, parallel, but at some point they converge, cross over at least. Maybe they don't ultimately end in the same place, but I like to at least cross them over and show the reader that these things are connected and that they're not just caring about 2 disparate things.
Mhm.
Now other writers may have different opinions about it, but that's just the way I do it. I like to if I'm gonna take the reader on this journey, I want them to feel like the world is connected, the the ultimate goals are connected, or at least, um, whether the resolution, whether they combine for the resolution or whether they just cross paths somewhere. I need them to tie together at some point for me.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think I don't even think it needs to be an explicit tying
Yeah,
together. It can be like implied, it can be just a piece of knowledge that ties them together. But I think when it comes to mapping out subplots, I encourage people to think about ways to bring everything together, at least by the climax. Maybe not completely resolved by the climax. You have a little bit of time in the following action to completely resolve things. But I would argue most subplots either get resolved by the climax or before it, which is something to
Yeah.
keep in mind while you're planning.
One book that I read, and I can't even remember what it was or who wrote it, but it was based around, well, at first it felt like 4 different vignettes that had nothing to do with each other, just snapshots of everyday life for these different people, and you had no idea why you're getting a look at these 4 different people because they don't seem to have anything to do with each other, and then at about the 90% mark, um, like 9/11 happened, and they were all in New York on that day, and
Wasn't
they just
expecting that.
randomly appeared there, and, for not randomly, but they all had
Yeah.
different purposes, and they just all converged at this time, at this day in
Mhm.
downtown Manhattan when the stuff happened.
Yeah.
And it felt like they were just completely, um, disparate and had nothing to do with each other, but then they all converged. And that's kind of how I think that may be an overly simplistic way of thinking about it, but that's a good kind of on the nose example of kind of bringing those things together at one point.
A less sad,
Similar, Jane, sounds a bit like The Stand, similar converge, yes, that's a good example as well.
less sad example, Love Actually, uh,
Mm, yeah,
where you have all the
that might
parents.
have been a better example, yeah. Actually.
Okay. So what I want to do real quick, we are getting close to the hour mark. Man, I could sit here and chat all day with everyone.
Oh,
But
yeah.
what I want to do is just share a little bit about what my answers looked like for the exercises, and I'll post these in the cafe this afternoon or tomorrow morning, as I do every week. But I know some folks like seeing examples because it helps them. So for the overview of conflicts, which is the very top part of your step one, create your conflicts. Now, I have my internal conflict here as just two jot notes, right? And then my external conflict, I have two primary notes and then broke down a couple of beats or a couple things that get in my character's way. I intentionally put these overview summaries at the very start of the exercise, and you might be thinking, wow, how the heck am I supposed to know this already? I haven't done any of the other exercises. But the idea is to condense your thoughts into a couple notes here, and then you're going to start expanding on them as you go. And what was cool about these exercises is that as I was going through, I started learning new things I want to include in my conflict. And I started learning new things I want to include in relationships. Specifically, I thought one relationship, my main character with her potential love interest, was just going to be positive. But through these exercises, I learned, hey, these three, the Nymir and Emmanuel, who are still alive, and Gadriel, who's dead, the source of Nymir's big hurt, they used to be very good friends, right? Like tighter than tight. Um, and Emmanuel hasn't had the chance to grieve since that event because he's been trying to support our main character this whole time. So now I'm like, okay, we're going to have this juicy moment where there's just this tension where we thought everything was going to be happy. And I would never have thought about that if we didn't do these exercises. Um, which is here. Actually, I skipped ahead. So at the same time, he's suppressing the fact that he hasn't grieved his friend yet is the last point in my Emmanuel paragraph there. And then Lita is the other character I was talking about. Again, when you're doing this, put in as much detail or as little that you want, but I suggest putting in at least a sentence or two.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that I really want people to pay attention to, and uh, this is, let me make sure I have it in the right spot. Down the second last heading, the interconnection of conflicts, there's the interplay between internal and external conflicts. This is where you really map out if your internal conflict and your external conflict are meshing together well, because you'll be able to see, hey, when this happens in the external, how does it affect my protagonist's internal conflict? And not everything needs to have that immediate tie in. There can be external conflict moments that don't necessarily touch on the internal conflict, but you want the majority to because that's how you make it more meaningful and you drive that growth or corruption. And then lastly, I just did this is from the step 2 exercises. There's a lot that you can map out here, but I suggest for each relationship that you want to bring to life in your story, at least do this 3-point subplot outline. And that tells you where it starts, some turning points throughout that make it worse or better, and then how it ends. And then you can start working around that, because next week we're talking about themes as well next week, but we're also going to start mapping this out in the plot grid and really structuring what it is you're going to write. And so putting in the work to think about these subplots and these relationships and these conflicts and these characters, that makes everything so much easier when you go to plug it all together. So I'll
Are
pull
you
that
gonna be
off.
showing your plot grid next week?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I think I'll try to pretty mine up
Okay.
and show a contrast to yours
Yeah.
as well, and just
Hanks will
see.
just be empty. That's the
Yeah,
contrast.
and then, our 3rd host, our co-host Josh, had a family commitment today, and that's the reason he's not joining us. He was, trying up until the very end to hope to get to join us, but he didn't get to today. But he has, a very different way of using the plot grid, I think, from either you or I, so,
Mhm.
I bet we can get him to show, a bit of his plot grid as well. I'll talk to him about that over the next couple of days and see if we
Yeah.
can't have maybe 3 different views of how each of us approach the plot grid and use it as a tool for our writing.
Yeah. My goal, a little sneak peek, well, not a peek actually, but a little breadcrumb. I want to make my plot grid super detailed, specifically to show everyone what you can do with the plot grid.
Yeah,
What I will be bringing to the table is more than I would normally do, and I think it's more than most people should do. But I want to show off what you can do on kind of the extreme end of plotting
yeah,
for this.
yeah, and I might show, how little you can do with the plot grid and it still be useful and, a valuable tool.
I was gonna say you just don't show up. That's
Yeah, there's always that. I mean, it depends on if I have turkey between now and then.
All right. So we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I shall be assigning the homework now. I feel so official when I do that. So in the
I need a
60-day
chalkboard.
novel challenge template, you have week 3. That's the folder that we're looking at as conflict and subplots. Specifically, focus on the main external conflict and your protagonist's primary internal conflict. If you can at least get those fleshed out, you are well on your way to being prepared to write those, minimum 1667 words a day when we hit November 1st. While you're creating them, while you're doing the homework, always be thinking about how these things overlap and influence one another and how they make each other stronger or more difficult, because that is where you'll get the best stuff to write about. And then take some time to brainstorm some subplots for your novel. Again, Hank, I think you'd agree with me, but a lot of subplots come naturally through the writing process.
Yeah,
So don't stress too much. Like, you don't need 15 columns in the plot grid when we get there about subplots. But just think about ones that you want to include and think about relationships specifically.
yeah. We have a
Anything to
question.
add? Oh,
We have a question from Robert. How do we tie conflicts together? Any tips?
I have tips.
Go ahead, Doug.
Well, tip number 1, do the exercises in the template. That's so sassy. I get it. So Robert is a Dabble employee. Hank and I report to Robert.
Yeah.
So so I can be this sassy. Um it just came off as rude to everybody. But what I did specifically, because I really want to buff up the internal conflict, is I have I think about the external conflict and what I want to have happen, the fun, flashy stuff. And then I think about my character's backstory and what she's struggling with. And then I kind of combine the two. So I have the city that's falling apart and this big bad demon. How do I create things within those two sources of conflict that really harp on that lie that she believes and her flaws? And my intention is to really dig as much out of that as I can. And so I tailor my external conflict to meet that.
Yeah, that's a boo, Jane. Boo.
That's funny.
Yeah, I don't really think a whole lot about how to bring those things together. I just look for opportunities, where they might converge.
Mm.
It's not something I've really planned out. They just seem to, as I'm kind of mapping out character arcs, they just kind of present themselves.
Mhm. Well, and what I do in the novel that I'm currently writing, I'm finding that there are some pieces of conflict that don't seem to relate to my protagonist's internal conflict. And when I'm rereading those, they feel a little bit shallower.
Yeah,
And part of that is bias because, I get to work with like my job is about writing. It's about providing information about writing. I get to write all the time. It's great. But part of it is from a reading perspective, and it says, okay, what's the point of this part of the external conflict? Why do I have this piece of conflict here? And when you can't answer that, then again, it starts to feel a little bit shallow. So it might be in the revision process that you go in and make it a little bit more meaningful to the internal conflict. But if you know your character well enough, if you've kind of put in the work beforehand to understand them, whether that's their backstory or just who they are and what their flaws are, then you will naturally start to drift towards things that exploit those flaws in that backstory.
right.
All right. I don't think we have any other questions. We just hit the hour mark. Oh, we're good at this, Hank.
Yes, we are. It's almost like we planned it that way.
All righty. So I think we will call it there. We don't have any extra podcast events or anything before our next challenge next week, but we do have Writing Sprint Wednesday on the 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And Robert, the one that we've been sassing this whole time, will, I believe, be the one hosting that all unless something comes up. So now that I've said it, it has to be true.
Yep.
So he will be there. We will be there in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to hop on over to the Storycraft Cafe, share your work, ask your questions, support one another, do your homework before we meet again next time. Same bat time, same bat place. And Hank, everyone here, thank you for joining. Bye,
Have a great
everyone.
day, everyone. Happy writing.